Hello and welcome. This is an overview of how to use portfolios as a student growth measure for the purposes of the teacher incentive allotment. There is also a guiding document posted on our website. There are several possible student growth measures that can be used for the purposes of TIA. Today's presentation will focus on portfolios. Districts would like to include other eligible teaching assignments for subjects and grade levels that may not be STAR tested. We wanted to provide guidance on all student growth measures so that districts can choose the best student growth measure for each eligible teaching assignment and that the stakeholders feel very confident that they are being accurately measured. Similar to the body of evidence used in SLOs or student learning objectives, portfolios have artifacts or student work tasks. TIA requires the implementation of a strong student growth measure or strong student growth measures to support the determination of a teacher's effectiveness. Like all student growth measures approved for TIA use, portfolios need to be a valid and reliable measure of student growth. Portfolios for TIA include the development of a quality skill progression rubric, student artifacts or student work, and strong protocols around administration and scoring. This student growth measure works well for performance-based courses, but is not limited to just performance-based courses. Portfolios for TIA include the development of a quality skill progression rubric, student artifacts or work tasks, and strong protocols around administration and scoring. This student growth measure works well for performance-based courses, but is not limited to only performance-based courses. Let's get started by answering this question. Are portfolios the right student growth measure for your district or for your eligible teaching group? Districts are currently using portfolios for CTE, fine arts, early childhood, and special education. As you know, there are many types of portfolios. However, for purposes of TIA, the portfolio must be an assessment portfolio. An assessment portfolio is a collection of completed artifacts that demonstrate student mastery, so what students know and are able to do, and a content and objectives for that given course. The portfolio must include a minimum of 5 artifacts that are standards aligned and are scored using a skill progression rubric throughout the year. Districts should follow these 4 main steps for a portfolio system to be effective for TIA. I will go through these in greater detail really soon. Based on those skill descriptors to which each student's beginning of year work most closely aligns, plus the additional other student data points, teachers set a targeted goal for the level on the skill progression rubric to which they expect each student's end of year work to align. Then, at the end of the year, a committee of multiple reviewers who are trained in the content area review multiple examples of students' end of year student work, artifacts, performances to determine to which level on the skill proficiency rubric at the end of the year the student work most closely aligns. The district then can calculate the percent of a teacher's students who met or exceeded their targeted growth goal based on comparing the beginning of year targeted goals to the results of the end of year portfolio scoring process. In a few slides, I will go into this in more detail and even show you a rubric example. It is best practice to include all of the students in a given class period or class periods as the group of students for whom the portfolio process will be used. Select the most representative class of students for each teacher. If the teacher teaches more than one group of students, for example, a high school teacher who teaches 5 class periods a day, select the class period that is most representative overall of the 5 class periods to be the group of students for whom the portfolio process will be used. Train a team of teachers and/or other professionals to evaluate student portfolios at the end of the year based on that skill progression rubric. Before moving forward, just to clarify, what portfolios for TIA are not is just a student work in progress or a display or showcase portfolios of the student's best work. So now we're going to talk about the pieces of student work that are used to place students on that rubric. We're calling the student work artifacts when we speak about portfolios. So a minimum of 5 pieces of student work or artifacts are recommended to use to assess the beginning of year skill level as well as the end of the year skill level on the skill proficiency rubric. So those artifacts are to be used as part of the portfolio to represent the content and the skill levels identified as the focus of the portfolio. Also, want to ensure that those artifacts are aligned to the standards and objectives for the course. They're also designed to differentiate various levels of performance. And we want to ensure that they are valid and really specific to the content being evaluated by the portfolio. So, for example, in instrumental music, choir, or theater class, the artifacts might be an audio or video recording of student performance, whereas something for like woodworking or welding class, those artifacts might be a sample of student-created woodwork or welding. So really, artifacts can and should vary within a content. When creating the skill progression rubrics, which are used to evaluate student portfolios, ensure that they are aligned to the curricular standards for the course and clearly aligned to the identified focus of the portfolio. Be sure to include descriptors of what student work or artifacts look like across the variety of proficiency levels. Also, ensure that you're using at least 5 skill levels of proficiency. So for example, significantly limited proficiency, partial proficiency, proficient, and then advanced. So this is just an example for the purpose of better understanding the rubric. So imagine a 7th grade drawing class whose main curricular content, when I say the main curricular content, I mean like the bulk of the course, which again, this is just an example. So the main curricular content for the course includes students' use of shading, proportion, and the ability to convey light and dark in a pencil drawing. So a rubric could be developed in a way that explains in detail what shading looks like across a variety of skill proficiencies, what proportion looks like across a variety of skill levels, and then what light and dark looks like across a variety of skill levels. So here's a possible rubric for that 7th grade drawing class. So if you look on the left side, they have the skills, the shading, proportion, and the use of light and dark. And then across the top are the skill proficiency levels. So the descriptors inside the boxes should describe in detail what the students can do at each proficiency level. So please remember this is just an example, but feel free to stop and read through those different descriptors and just better understand the example of the rubric. So if a district decides that portfolios sound like a great student growth measure for an eligible teaching assignment, they're going to want to use these 4 steps to guide them in that process. So determining the curricular content of the portfolio, designing the artifacts or assignments for the portfolio, developing a quality rubric, and then evaluating those student artifacts in the portfolio of work. So step 1 is to determine the curricular content of the portfolio. So to do this, you want to ensure that they are aligned to the curricular standards of the course, that it highlights what students have to know and be able to do, and then it centers on content that is foundational to the curriculum and lends itself to being demonstrated by those artifacts. The second step is to design the artifacts that will be part of the portfolio. As a reminder, it's recommended to use a minimum of 5 artifacts in the portfolio. These artifacts should be designed to measure the specific curricular standards that are determined in the last step, step 1. A good question to ask is, does this task actually measure student proficiency on the selective content objective? Also, be sure to think about, is this artifact designed to be able to measure a range of student proficiency levels, because we are trying to look for student growth. So let's check for understanding. So again, this is just a made-up example to practice this. And feel free to pause this video and look at the curricular standards on the left, and then look at the list of artifacts on the right. So jot down which artifacts would best allow students to demonstrate their understanding of the content and skills. So go ahead and look at each skill and the proficiency level the student is able to demonstrate for each skill based on that artifact. So when you think of their use of light and dark, shading and proportion, the spiral week collage is probably not the most valid artifact, where a 2-dimensional sketch or 3-dimensional sketch, you can see the different levels of how that student is able to use light and dark, shading, and proportion. Once you have those 5 or more really solid quality artifacts that will demonstrate student growth, you're going to move on to step 3, which is developing the quality rubric and really defining what that student performance standards look like. So you want to make sure that the rubric specifies in detail in those descriptor boxes of what those artifacts are going to look like or sound like across a variety of skill proficiency levels. We recommend using at least 5 proficiency levels, and that the rubric constantly checking to ensure that it is aligned to the curricular standards or objectives that were determined in step 1. Here is an example of what that skill proficiency rubric can look like. This is a well-designed rubric, and it has 3 different parts. So there's the skills the students demonstrate, the proficiency levels, and the detailed descriptors. Keep in mind that the skills are not specific to one assignment, but they're really in alignment to the curricular standards as an assessment of skills. Okay, again, we recommend those 5 performance levels across the top. So when you're writing out the descriptors for the skills and in accordance with the different performance levels, you want to think about where is the highest level, so that advanced column, and that should indicate that that student has exceeded that standard. And that second highest level, where it's proficient, they have met that standard. The next one may be that they were approaching the standard, and then some of the lower ones, they should be around how that student has not met that standard or is not meeting the standards. Again, so each skill and performance level should contain a precise explanation of that student performance. So we're calling these descriptors, those descriptions, descriptors. Each descriptor should be clearly different from the performance levels below and above it. So make sure that the descriptors of the student performance in the highest category are aligned, or they maybe exceed with a mastery of those relevant standards. 4, the final step, is to evaluate student artifacts in that portfolio of work. So all student artifacts in the portfolio are assessed based on that rubric that was designed in step 3. So reviewers are trained and calibrated or normed on that use of the rubric, and preferably they have content knowledge in that course. Also making sure that there are multiple reviewers who are trained in the content review of the student portfolios in order to increase obviously the reliability of the entire portfolio system for TIA. Then you really want to have a system where there's a comparison of the student artifacts using that rubric from the beginning of the year to the student work at the end of the year, and then being able to see how that student demonstrates growth along that skill proficiency rubric throughout the entire year. So in this example, we look at a possible rubric for a 7th grade drawing class. So there are 3 focuses for this drawing class: shading, proportion, and use of light and dark. And then those are shown on the left-hand side of the rubric. Then you will notice for each of these focus areas, there are detailed descriptors across those 5 proficiency levels. And they are significantly limited proficiency, partial proficiency, proficient, and advanced. So using a sample of this teacher's students' drawings over the first few weeks of school, so let's say ideally it would be the first 4 to 6 weeks of school, a teacher would be able to match each student's skill level as demonstrated in their early drawings, and they would match that to a specific skill level descriptor in each one of these categories, so shading, proportion, and use of light and dark. So for example, if a student's drawings might show some attempts to use shading in at least some of the parts of their drawings, which would align to that descriptor for limited proficiency, which states attempt is made to use shading in some parts of a drawing. Another student's drawings may show shading that actually adds a sense of dimension to their drawings, which would align to the descriptor for proficiency, which states shading is used to add a sense of dimensionality consistently to the drawing. So then the teacher would assess each student's series of drawings that they produce during those first few weeks of school, so ideally no more than those first 6 weeks. And they would do that across shading, proportion, and use of light and dark, and then align that work to the corresponding skill descriptor that best describes that drawing, or I should say their drawings for each of these 3 skill areas. So here's a sample set of beginning of year skill proficiencies for a class of 25 students. So let's look at this rubric. It shows 2 students whose drawing aligned to significantly limited proficiency for proportion. So 16 students whose drawings aligned to limited proficiency, and 7 students whose drawings aligned to partially proficient for the skill of shading. So Miss Rose looked at her student work for the 2 students, let's call them Denise and Scott. And so they were placed at significantly limited proficiency, meaning that their work demonstrated limited or no use of shading in their drawings. So Miss Rose decided that, she's an effective teacher, and by the end of the year, based on student work data and their beginning of year placement on this rubric, she sets a growth goal, a growth target to partial proficiency. So for Denise and for Scott, based on that data, which would mean that their work would need to demonstrate that shading is used to add sense of dimensionality in some parts of their drawing. So by the end of the year, Ms. Rose is going to look at where Denise and Scott landed on the rubric for each artifact. So then this chart shows the growth made from the beginning of year to the end of the year in just the skill of shading. So if you look at the left column where it says BOY, it's beginning of year, and then the top row where it says end of year. So Denise exceeded her goal of partial proficiency and ended the year at proficient. Scott met his goal and ended the year at partial proficiency in shading. So a chart like this should be completed for each skill. So just to recap, using the multiple examples of student work, artifacts, performances from the beginning of the year, the teachers determine to which skill on the skill proficiency rubric each student's beginning of year student work, artifacts, performances most closely aligns, based on the skill descriptors to which each student's beginning of year work most closely aligns, plus the additional other data points that teacher will set a targeted growth goal for each student on the skill progression rubric to which they expect the student's end of year work to align. So then at the end of the year, a committee of multiple reviewers who are trained and in the content area and also in using that rubric review multiple examples of students' end of year work, artifacts, performances to determine which level on the skill proficiency rubric they are at the end of the year and which and how that work actually aligns. So where does it most closely align? So then the district can calculate the percent of students, of that teacher's students who met or exceeded their targeted growth goal. And then based on comparing that beginning of year targeted growth goal to the results of the end of year portfolio scoring performance, that's how they will determine designations. So I've also posted guidance about this entire process in a Word document, and like a 2-pager that aligns with this video on our website. So if once you read through that and you watch this video, you still have any questions, please reach out to us by emailing the email address below. Thank you so much.